Hey there, I'm Heather Sullivan. Welcome to Sullivan Smart Sense. Thanks so much for being with us. As you know, we meet here every Tuesday and we talk about ways to help you save money, deal with money, do better with your money, anything that's got to do with money. We're going to talk about here. And today we're going to talk about something that is, I think, such a useful skill and probably really underutilized. I think it intimidates a lot of people. But maybe you need to negotiate a raise, or maybe you're in a job search and you want to be sure that you're negotiating the best position, the best compensation, or maybe you are trying to buy a car and you want to do a little negotiating. Negotiating comes up in a lot of ways in our lives. So today we are bringing in an expert to help us figure out how to be better negotiators. So I can't wait to have this conversation. Please join me in welcoming. This is Andres Lares. He is with the Shapiro Negotiations Institute. Thanks so much for being with us, Andres.
Thank you for having me, Heather.
Well, let's just dive right into it. First, let's just talk about why are people so uncomfortable or afraid to negotiate?
Well, I liked what you said earlier about intimidation. And so there's a lot of reasons, but the two most common are kind of the two ends of the spectrum. So we feel like in a negotiation, if we don't push hard enough, we're going to leave money on the table. And that never feels good, right? It feels like
Right.
we got maybe taken advantage of, especially if there isn't kind of the same amount of information on both sides. But the other side is if we push too hard, we can damage the relationship. And of course, those two fears become more and more important the more important and valuable the negotiation is, or the more personal it is. So certainly one, when negotiating your job salary, that might be the same person you have to work with every day. So pushing too hard can be scary, but pushing hard enough can equally be scary.
How do you kind of help someone overcome those concerns and fears?
Well, it's not the sexiest answer, but there's a lot of evidence to support that it is the best answer, which is preparation. So what happens about preparation, if you take enough time to prepare, and it doesn't have to be, days, weeks, or an immense number of hours, but if you take time to prepare, two things happen. So the first is you're going to actually have more information in order to negotiate better. But the second and the underrated aspect is you're going to be more confident. And so if you're thinking about how to be a better negotiator, perhaps the most basic principles to remember is if you prepare, you'll have more information, you'll negotiate better and be more confident. And both of those are very powerful.
Okay, so I feel like we've got good tools to start going through the process. How do you go about kind of just teaching someone the basics of negotiation? I've seen different people talk about it, and they kind of I guess have different theories about approaching it. So I'm really curious to hear how someone can kind of just learn some basics of doing this.
Yeah, so one of the we teach a kind of a three-part process, if you will, to negotiation. So negotiations can be complex, so it's difficult to be able to perfectly kind of distill it down to three words. But essentially, if you think of it, first it's preparation. We talked about that, so it's really important. The second, and perhaps the most important, is probing and listening. So asking great questions is typically the sign of a good negotiator. We often think negotiators are the slick talkers and the smooth talkers, but really it's people who ask questions because they both find out more information, deeper discovery, but they also develop relationships. And then find the third is propose. And so that's kind of the natural culmination of the three. And so that's where we get a little bit more tactical. And you want to think about should you go first or not, which is called anchoring. Should you make multiple equal simultaneous offers so the other party feels like they're in control? So those are kind of the three steps. If you think about it that way, you prepare. It's about efficient and effective preparation. Probing, ask as many questions as you can, and then finally proposing. Really think about how you can reach your objectives, but also satisfy the other side, especially if you're going to see them again, right? Maybe if you're buying a house, not as important. You may never see them again. But in a job, that is very important if you're going to be, seeing your boss the next morning.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you will, let's use an example. Let's say you're going to go in and try and negotiate a raise and then go through these different parts one, two, and three. So let's say we want to go and try and get a raise. How do we need to approach that for these different steps?
Yeah. So first step, what I would do is I would first look at the comparables. So you're negotiating a raise. That's your research. The most practical research is okay. What's this job pay in other places? What does this job pay within my company? If I can find, there's a lot of online resources. So that would be kind of the precedence, if you will, the comparables. The second step is I would script a little bit. I would think, okay, how do I want to make this request? And why do I do that? Because the first time I go about it, I'm probably going to be emotional. I'm making X and I want to make Y. And so maybe I'm frustrated, I'm underpaid, or I feel this pressure to make more money because I've got increasing expenses, whatever it may be. But sort of putting that down on paper, what you want to say, then you take a step back and come back to it a little later or the next day and do a little bit of editing. So what does that process do? Now that process, you fine tuned your message. Now you're not going to write down every single word you're going to say, but you're going to write down main points. For example, you might start off with a little bit of empathy because that's really important. So, for example, I understand that we've frozen hiring, or there's even been some layoffs recently, and I understand this is difficult, but I want to talk to you about something that's really important to me. That would be an example of you understand the context, you have empathy for the other party, which is really important. So that might be a point you want to say if it's genuine. And then you can get into, okay, what have you done recently and why are you so valuable to the company? And so going through that scripting process helps you kind of refine that message. Then the next step would be I'd write down a whole bunch of questions to ask. It's not a one-way megaphone. It's, certainly you might make the ask, but you're also going to want to talk about, okay, walk me through one other situations where you've been able to give other people raises, or other situations where you've been able to promote people to a higher title. Talk to me about that. What are you looking for? Things like that. You really want to ask a lot of questions. And then finally, the third is propose. So we talked a little bit earlier about kind of anchoring when to go first, when not. In this particular example, I would recommend not going first. So you want to ask for more, but I would leave the ball in their court, because there is going to be that natural tendency we talked about, that fear that if you ask for too much, you might be considered greedy. Ask for not enough, you're leaving money on the table. So you can kind of build your case and your value, ask a lot of questions, you're well prepared, and then you make an ask for more money and put the ball in their court. What do you think is fair based on everything you know, since you're privy to other people's salary, and put the ball in their court? So that would be my recommendation for that particular situation.
Wow, that is really detailed and really insightful. Here's what I'm wondering. So you're in part 2 and you're asking questions about what are scenarios where you've been able to give other people raises. What if you start hearing from them, well, I just haven't been, things are tight. You just start, instead of them sort of giving you some of those positive opportunities, you're really just kind of being shut down. What do you do with that?
So I think there's two things you can do. One is kind of change the way you're asking questions, or kind of the types of questions you're asking. So that might mean, okay, I understand that you don't have it in the budget. I'm sorry to hear. This is something that's really important to me. So I just want to work through this a little more, if you don't mind. Have there been situations where you've had something that's important to you that's not in the budget? Have you been able to find other budgets to pull from? So that would be the type of example I'd bring up and sort of pivot a little bit. Or the other thing you can do is either change the time, the situation, the location, or the person. So for example, if you're not going anywhere, do you say, okay, look, thank you for this. It's really helpful information. Not what I was hoping to hear, candidly, but I do want to circle back. Can we reconnect in 2 weeks? I want to take the time to digest everything we've said. What you're purposely doing is putting time in between, giving yourself time to prepare again. But also, you may have caught that person on a bad day. They may just have had budget cuts. Something else may be going on there. And just merely changing the location of the time can help do that. And then if that still doesn't work, I'd consider changing the person, right? If you're talking to your boss, consider HR. If you're talking to HR, consider your boss. But huge caveat, think through how to do that in a way where you don't really step on the other person's toes, right? Either you give them a heads up in advance or whatever it may be, just to kind of think through that a little bit.
That you kind of touched on my next question, but should you expect an answer by the end of this conversation, or is it better to say, if you could take some time to think about this for me, is that a better way to go?
Well, if the other person's a skilled negotiator, they likely are not going to give you an answer there. And that's for a couple of things. First of all, it's probably other stakeholders they need to think about it, talk to other people. But the second is, even if they could immediately say yes, it's best not to, because it feels like, for example, I'll give you an example. You ask for a raise, you want X thousand more dollars, and then right there and then they said, okay, yep, we can do that starting next Monday. How would you feel? Your first reaction is, I should have asked for more. So if they're a skilled negotiator, they're not going to do that. And so I say that exact example so you realize that even if you are going to get it and there's good reason and you're valued, you may not get that immediate yes. And that's a part of the process. I think one of the things we want people to remember is negotiation is a process and not an event. So I wouldn't expect anything to happen immediately. It can, but I wouldn't expect anything to happen immediately.
When I've gone in, I usually go in with a piece of paper that's even got some of my arguments or points or things I've accomplished, and I'll leave that with them. Good idea, or do you think it should be just verbal?
No, so I mean, it's certainly not a bad idea, and there's a lot of times where it makes sense. I think it's about who you're talking to. So if you're talking to a person that needs to, for example, convince other people, the more ammunition you give them in writing kind of what value you bring to the table, the easier it is for their job to be able to potentially influence other people. So I think it's a great idea. If that's potentially a decision maker, then maybe it, doesn't potentially help as much. But I think it rarely would hurt, but it certainly can be impactful in particular to make their job easy for them, right? Help them do whatever they need to do to get you what you want.
Yeah. It helps me too, because I can, when you start to get nervous, you just refer to what you already have on paper.
And that's
Um,
exactly the scripting, right? You get more confidence because you kind of thought through it before. You feel like, okay, this makes sense what I'm about to say, rather than, ooh, I hope what I said just makes sense.
yeah. Well, let's change the scenario. What if you're buying a car, and you want to get that price down? We've seen such high prices with cars these days. Walk us through. What would you do there?
So you're buying a car, it's definitely a different animal. There's really a lot more there, but a couple of things. First of all, you have to understand kind of the macro market. So if you're buying a car a year ago, all the leverage was with the people selling the car, right? There was a car shortage, used, new, everything. As time goes on, we're seeing less and less of those shortages. So it's a little bit more likely that you are able to, in fact, kind of get a deal. So how do you do that? I think you want to think about it's empathy again. You want to think of the other party. What does a salesperson want to do? Well, they want to sell more cars. They want to be very efficient in selling it, and they particularly want to hit their quotas.
Yeah.
So what would I do? I would come towards the end of a month. I'd be willing to act very quickly. I would have, so it's one of those things where, okay, if you know what you want, have your comparables, make an offer, and be willing to move very quickly. So, if it's a $25,000 car, if you're offering 22.5, okay, but are you willing to buy today? Are is it one of those things you have to go back and forth and come back? So that's the type of thing I want to think about. Is I want to think, okay, what is it that they want, and how do I give it to them in order to then get what I want?
Okay. Let's go through some of the just scenarios when things might look difficult when people are engaged in the negotiation process. What if, the person they're talking to is just kind of, being pushy or pushing back?
So whenever, and I'm going to kind of pool this into they're being potentially difficult, right? So they're generally being difficult, could be pushier for whatever reason. So there's three reasons why this typically happens. So the first is it works for them strategically, right? I am difficult, I'm pushy, whatever I am, and it works for me. So that's where unfortunately kind of the used car salesperson can
Yeah.
concept come from, even for folks that don't do that. But it works for them, so they continue to do it. The second is they're simply difficult, which is very rare. It's just someone who's very difficult to deal with, and it's possible, but it's rare. The third is it's situationally difficult. So you think of the first strategically, you've got to kind of call them on it or find someone else. You think simply, you got to find someone else because, in the rare case, they're just that way. But the third is situationally, meaning that, they woke up on the wrong side of the bed, their kid is sick, they're having a bad day at work. Well, they're literally coming back an hour or two later, coming back the next day, making small changes to the environment. All those things can be really helpful. So what I would say is, the first thing is, why are they being pushy? Why are they being difficult? What's driving that? And then you can decide what you do based on that. But the first big step is kind of take a breath, because what people don't realize is if they're being pushy or difficult, that only has an impact if it has an impact on you, right? If you feel anxious, then you do things that you may regret. But if they're being pushy and you realize, look, what they're doing doesn't impact me, right? This car, the most I'm going to be paying for this car is X. I don't care what they do. And then you just got to take that step back and you do that. You're going to find that you're going to negotiate more successfully.
Okay, that's a good tip, to kind of just separate yourself from what they're doing a little bit. I've had this come up where even though you've even booked an appointment, booked a time to talk to someone, they're just, distracted. They're not really, they're just doing all kinds of things and not really paying attention, not really listening. What do you do?
So that can definitely be frustrating. And so it's tough to manage those. I think there's probably two ways to deal with that. I mean, the two particularly we would recommend. One is, and this is in a lesser case, but it does happen, take advantage of that. There are times where someone's distracted and all of a sudden they don't realize what they do. And really, it's their fault and their problem, right? They're essentially not being respectful. They're trying to multitask four things on an appointment. They're not really taking it seriously. You may find that sometimes, and this does happen, they kind of want to get this done and they're just kind of hurrying it up. And all of a sudden they make a mistake. And that's happened before. We've seen that happen before. So one is, unfortunately, their disrespect can come at a cost for them. The other is kind of call it on and say, look, I understand right now it looks like you're busy. Why don't I come back in half an hour? Are we able to make sure that we could get kind of a concentrated time together, or the next day, or something like that? Can I call them out? Be nice about it. Not, now potentially if it's egregious, you could say, look, I don't feel like I'm getting the time of day that I deserve. So how do we make this work? But I think, generally you want the softest approach you can take, the better, because you want them to be on your side, right? You're still trying to kind of collaborate with them. But like I said, maybe there is something really pressing, right? And so you never really know when that's kind of the person that it is and that's what they do, or there's something actually pressing there.
Okay. What if they're just talking too much?
So that's a problem because it's not efficient,
Yeah.
but it can actually be helpful from an information standpoint. So I
Okay.
would say, as much as you can, be patient and take in that information. And I would say we've advised on some very, very large deals, whether it's player contracts, and we've had agents that want to lecture teams, or M&A transactions where the buyer or the seller wants to educate, quote unquote, the other side. And oftentimes, allowing them to do that is actually a really important part of the negotiation process. So even though in the back of your mind you're thinking, I already know this, or whatever it may be, oftentimes allowing that to happen, it goes back to that piece, which is negotiating is a process, not an event. And so rarely an important negotiation, we have one call, one meeting, boom, boom, done. So if you think about it that way, it's a part of the process. You'll find that you will be a little bit more, patient, if you will, and therefore find better results.
Okay. What if it just doesn't seem like they're just working with you, collaborating, like it's just, I guess it's just not really going well.
Yeah. So, there the really the thing you want to think about is a BATNA, which is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And so, really, what you want to think through is, okay, what options do you have? So, one of the things we always tell people is alternatives are the best way to generate leverage. So, what do I mean by that? You're buying a car. If you fall in love with a car, before you go to buy that car, I would recommend you look at two or three other cars you'd be willing to live with. And even though it sounds crazy, that mere act of saying, okay, if I don't get this car, there are other options, even if I don't want them as much, that will empower you to be able to either walk away or push harder, do whatever it is you need to do in the negotiation to get a better deal. So, for example, what would that look like? Okay, if we see that through, there are two other cars you'd be willing to buy, but you prefer this one. When you're negotiating, they just aren't willing to give. Your willingness to actually walk away, get up from the table and say, you know what? We don't have to get all the way to my ask, but we definitely need to move where we are now. And so, if not, I'll come back or I'll look at other options. Well, you walking away, two things may happen. That person may say, okay, okay. They take you more seriously because you're willing to walk away, or they may not. They may let you walk away. And even then, they may still come back. I can tell you that I've seen that happen before. But that comes from the leverage of knowing you have another option. So when you're buying a house, when you're buying a car, when you're negotiating a salary, do your best to come up with options, whether it's different deal structures or different cars, different houses, different jobs, whatever it could be. That'll give you more confidence and more leverage.
Okay. I want to circle back to the negotiating a salary scenario, and because we're seeing the marketplace change, and
Yep.
up until recently, because the labor the demand for labor has been such that you people have been able to negotiate higher pay and all of that kind of stuff, and if they didn't get what they wanted, they could say no, and still win. But now, we have this possibility of a recession. So we don't know if we want everybody up and quitting their jobs, or saying, well, if you don't give me my raise, I'm out of here. So what would be your advice, if you're kind of coming to this point where it looks like, well, I'm not getting what I want, like, how should you handle that?
Yeah, so definitely the market's changed. And I think part of that is the fear of the recession. But certainly the market's changed because we've seen a lot of industries, for example, mainly tech, but others that, really not only no longer hiring at first, there was a hiring freeze, but then really also do some pretty large layoffs. So that's changing the market, which means there's all these other people now in the market, and that's the supply and demand starting to change. So I think first you got to be aware of that. So, really what I like to describe for the salary negotiations, you want to think of 0 to 10, right? And a scale of, okay, how important is this raise? So what do I mean by that? If, let's say it's a 1, it's a nice to have. I love this company. I think I'm worth a little more. It would be nice to get paid a little bit more. But even if that doesn't happen, I'll still be happy to be here. And for 10, if the example of if I don't get this raise, I'm leaving, and I'm leaving very soon this week because I've got 3 other options and I'm taking one. So you want to think about is, when that's kind of closer to the 0 or 1, you take a softer approach, right? And so a softer approach, because if you don't get it, you still have a great relationship, And it doesn't all go for naught, right? It's something that you can kind of surface back 3 months later, 6 months later. So, for example, you have a conversation, they say, look, we just can't do it right now. Times are tough. We're buckling down for potential recession. What I would do is rather than saying, oh, darn, and then just walk away, is I'd say, okay, great. Or not great, but okay, I understand. That's unfortunate, not what I wanted to hear. This is something that's really important to me. And I know this conversation is something that's fluid. So why don't we put something in the books 3 months from now? We can see how Q4 ends and we can kind of reconvene in 3 months to talk about it again. So what you've done is you've already kind of created some momentum. They now know this is important to you. In 3 months, it won't be a surprise. So you actually have created some progress. In the 10 example, the first time I would still be nice about it. I probably would never right off the bat say, if I don't get a raise, I'm out of here. But I would say in that spectrum, I'd say, look, this is really important to me. And if they kind of put you off, say, I think the importance it is to me is not at the same level of the importance I think perceived by you all. We really got to make sure we address this. So how are we going to do that? And when are we going to do that and put the ball in their court? So that's kind of how you approach it based on how willing you are to push it. But in any case, I think empathy and I think approaching it the nice way, you can still be very firm and aggressive without being very difficult and pushy and put off the other side.
Okay, that's great advice. And if I can just throw out one time I had an experience where I had asked for a promotion. I didn't get it at that time. But a year later, they came back and said, remember what you said about, this? Well, now's your chance. So for anybody out there watching, just sometimes it'll come a little bit later. Well, this has been a fantastic crash course in how to negotiate. So I want to thank you so much for sharing all of this insight with us. If people want to continue to learn more about how to negotiate, where can they go?
Yeah, so probably the easiest would be either a LinkedIn or a website. So as you said, it's shapironegotiations.com for Shapiro Negotiation Institute. And on LinkedIn as well, we've got quite a few kind of resources. But yeah, we'd love to hear from anybody, and we've got plenty of resources there. But thank you very much for having me, Heather.
Yeah, Andres, thanks so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Have a great day.
You too. And thank you for being with us as well. Hope we gave you some great tips. I really learned a lot from this. So go out there and negotiate for yourself. Get the raise, get the bigger job, get a lower price on the car, whatever it is you need to do. And if you've got any other questions about any other financial topics you'd like us to cover, just keep those questions and comments coming, and we will address them right here on Sullivan Smart Sense. Until next time, have a great day.